that even if we face this crisis with U.S. assistance, remember that there's assistance coming from other areas as well.
Mm.
And as significant as the U.S. assistance has been, the aid from Europe has been even larger to Ukraine, even though we don't talk about it as much. So U.S. aid is needed. The future authorization is needed, but it does not mean that all assistance for Ukraine collapses if these hard right Republicans continue to, hold Kyiv hostage.
So there is a chance that US may be able to or may not be able to continue with the assistance, but then European nations or the other Western nations are still providing. Which brings me to the next point, sir. There have been many reports of European nations that are backing off from sending aid to Ukraine as well. Of course, not all of them, there are few. But can this be seen in conjunction with the US increasing distance from Ukraine or inability to continue with the aid to Ukraine?
Well, we need to be careful about media reports because the media can get very excited, and I understand that. In fact, when you're talking about European countries that are blocking or suspending assistance to Ukraine, to my knowledge, there are two. There is Hungary, led by a man named Viktor Orban, who's been a longtime ally of Vladimir Putin, and there's Slovakia, whose new government under Robert Fico is also suspending further military aid, at least government military aid, if not private aid to Ukraine. Those are the only two countries we're talking about that are really blocking aid to Ukraine individually. The problem, the challenge is if Hungary, in particular, which is a member of the European Union, tries to block European Union assistance to Ukraine and tries to block further sanctions against Russia. So Hungary, in other words, can be a spoiler in those cases where you need a unanimous EU decision to continue aid to Ukraine. But I wouldn't, let's not confuse Hungary and Slovakia with representing most of Europe. In the past few days, we've had further commitments of military, economic, and financial aid from countries such as Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and beyond Europe. Japan has just pledged another $175 million in reconstruction assistance.
Now, I just wanted to get your opinion on this one as well, Professor. There were reports that Europe will be unable to supply some 1 million rounds of artillery shells. So even if they do not want to back off from providing aid to Ukraine, do you feel there is an inability, like US is finding, there is an inability of funds or could be an internal conflict of interest as far as the US is concerned? Europe is also facing some kind of inability to continue providing the kind of aid that Ukraine needs, given the basis of this report which I just mentioned?
Well, the Europeans are providing some artillery shells to Ukraine. The issue is that they will not meet the 1 million artillery shells target by March. As of October, they had provided about 300,000. And that is an important structural issue. You're talking about not just ramping up, but reconfiguring an entire arms industry because of the imminent crisis of the Russian invasion. And that takes time. You don't just simply flick a switch overnight to get that increase in hundreds of thousands of shells. So I do think that while the target has been missed in March, again, the issue is Europe on a longer-term course to provide these types of munitions and other assistance? I'll put it in my words. This is not a sprint. The media quite often likes to say, let's finish this. Let's have a result. You don't get a sprint in defeating Russia. It is more of a marathon. And the question is, will the U.S., Europe, other countries across the international community, including India, what place do they have in that marathon as we continue to face the reality that Vladimir Putin tried and so far has failed to conquer his neighbor?
And that pretty much brings me to the next one that I want to ask you, sir. What's next as per you? Where do you see this heading? It's not a sprint. It is going to be a kind of a marathon. But how long do you think it's going to last? What's next in the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I think there are individual developments on the battlefield. It is not a complete stalemate as is represented in the media. The Russians have tried for now almost 2 months to take a city in the east of Ukraine, Avdiivka, just to show that they can still take a city. They are suffering heavy casualties trying to do so. In the south, the most significant story has been that Ukraine has advanced in recent weeks and is now on the east side of the Dnipro River. This is in the Kherson region. If they continue this advance, and it is an if, then it does mean that they are starting to move towards the coastline and could begin with that objective of cutting off Russian-occupied Crimea. I don't think you'll have a significant victory, as it were, over the winter. But I do think by early 2024, we're going to look at that gradual Ukrainian advance and assess, okay, is this enough where the battle will continue, or do we move to negotiations, even with Russia still in control of some of Ukraine? The problem with negotiations, cut up through the propaganda, the spin, the one person who is against negotiations is a guy named Vladimir Putin. Because if he ever negotiates, he has to admit that his dream of seizing at least 4 regions in Ukraine, plus Crimea, that dream has ended.
All right, Professor Lucas, thank you so much for joining in with all your insights on this. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and we'd like to have you back on WION to discuss matters further. Of course, this and a lot more that's happening all over the world.
Always a pleasure. My best to you, my best to your viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made an unannounced visit to Kiev. The visit was aimed at easing Ukrainian concerns that support from its biggest ally could waver.
The message that I bring you today, Mr. President, is that the United States of America is with you. We will remain with you for the long haul. What happens here in Ukraine, that not only matters to Ukraine, but it matters to the rest of the world. It certainly matters to the United States of America. And so the United States and our allies and partners will continue to work to give Ukraine the capabilities that it needs to be successful.
The Pentagon chief underscored Washington's continued commitment to providing Ukraine with the security assistance. The trip to Kiev is Austin's second since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Austin's surprise visit does draw attention to the fact that, however, that hardline Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives have raised doubts about the future of American assistance. Besides the Israel-Hamas war and an accompanying spike in attacks on American forces in West Asia has drawn international attention away from Ukraine. But that does not mean that civilian casualties have stopped in Ukraine. Just hours ago, 2 people were killed in Kherson after Russian forces shelled a parking lot in the southern Ukrainian city. Regional prosecutors opened a war crimes investigation into the artillery strike. Austin's visit comes a day after Ukraine announced it had pushed Russian forces back 3 to 8 kilometers from the banks of Dnipro River. If confirmed, it would be the first meaningful advance by Kiev's forces months into a disappointing counter-offensive. Ukrainian and Russian forces have been entrenched on opposite sides of the vast waterway in the southern Kherson region for more than a year. Russia withdrew its troops from the western bank last November. But apart from this development, not much has happened in terms of major breakthroughs in the war. This has sparked fears that the war in Ukraine has stalled, and pending serious global efforts at ceasefires, all but very minor changes can be expected in the near future. Now, the state of affairs in Ukraine begs the question on whether a stalemate situation has begun to emerge on the Russia-Ukraine war, and also whether there is a visible fatigue in the West on continuing supply of arms to Ukraine.
Let's move on to another war taking place currently, the Russia-Ukraine war. It has been over 630 days since the war began in Eastern Europe. Now the fighting has been concentrated around Dnipro River. Here's a sum up of what has been happening on the battlefield. Russian defense forces say they are inflicting heavy losses on Ukrainian troops at the Dnipro River. This comes after Ukraine claimed to have successfully established a foothold on the Russian-controlled eastern bank. However, Moscow says Ukrainian forces are still on the western bank of the river and lost over 460 men, 2 tanks and 17 vehicles. While Ukraine says its troops are engaged in fierce fighting as it tries to push back Russians across the river in Kherson. If the claims are true, this could be a major success for Kyiv, which has not been able to garner any significant gain to turn the tide of the war. Ukrainian president also posted few pictures showing Ukrainian troops on boats on the eastern bank of Dnipro. Kiev said it has managed to gain a foothold on several bridgeheads. This could clear way for a sustained offensive in the south and towards Crimean Peninsula. Meanwhile, Russia continues to shell Ukrainian towns and villages across the river, forcing civilian evacuations in the region. The governor of Kherson says one person has been killed in the latest shelling, while at least 3 deaths were reported the day before. As the winter descends upon the region, Ukraine is bracing for increased Russian airstrikes across the region. Ukrainian president warned that Moscow is likely to stockpile missiles to hit energy facilities in the coming months. Last year, Ukraine suffered crippling blackouts after Russian strikes hit power stations and electrical grid. Kiev has urged its allies abroad to bolster their supply of air defense systems. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for rapid changes in the operations of Ukraine's military. He also sacked the commander of medical forces. Zelensky's decision comes after he met Defense Minister Rustem Umerov. He said quick action is needed for forthcoming changes. Zelensky also added that Ukraine needs a fundamentally new level of medical support for the soldiers. Last week, Ukrainian troops claimed they had recaptured occupied areas in the south and east. Earlier, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief also said the war was about to enter a new phase. And for that, Ukraine needed more sophisticated technology to counter the Russian military. Several military experts are claiming that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is moving in a slow pace. However, Zelensky has repeatedly denied any stalemate, as he called on his Western allies to maintain their military support. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State of Defense Lloyd Austin arrived in Kiev to deliver what he said was an important message. Austin's visit comes at a time when the U.S. Congress is split over the Ukraine military aid.
Moscow has loaded an intercontinental ballistic missile equipped with the nuclear-capable Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle into a launch silo in southern Russia. Now, the video on the wall, which we'll show you shortly, it shows Russia's ballistic missile being transported to the launch silo. Take a look at this one. Now, the ICBM equipped with the nuclear-capable Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle warhead was slowly raised into vertical position and then lowered into a shaft. Now, the video broadcast by the Russian Defense Ministry was said to be shot at the Domborovsky missile base in the Orenburg region near Kazakhstan. It is said to be the same Orenburg facility where Russia installed its first Avangard-equipped missile back in 2019. That is the region right there. Now, let me further explain to you how Russia's Avangard warhead works. Now, the Avangard is carried on RS-18A, the intercontinental ballistic missile, and the warhead is carried to a suborbital altitude of around 100 kilometers by the carrier missile. That is the range where it reaches. As soon as the missile approaches its target, the Avangard glide vehicle detaches from the rocket and it then maneuvers outside the trajectory of the rocket, like a typical hypersonic missile would. And it constantly alters its trajectory, making it very difficult to intercept. Now, the warhead accelerates at supersonic speeds, and this means it can travel up to 27 times the speed of sound. Basically, the Avangard warhead can reach speeds of up to 32,000 kilometers per hour, to give you better perspective of that. Now, the warhead has a range of over 6,000 kilometers. It weighs approximately 2,000 kilograms with either a 2 megaton nuclear or conventional high explosive warhead. Now, Russia's Avangard warhead is also one of the 6 invincible weapons unveiled by Russian President Vladimir Putin in 2018. Now, if we go further back in time, Russian research into hypersonic warheads began under the Soviet Union in the 1980s, which was expanded in the mid-1990s with the designation Project 4202. Ironically, further development was delayed because of Russia's 2014 military invasion of Ukraine, as critical components for the HGVs control systems were of Ukrainian design and manufacture. Now, this